Kindness by Naomi Shihab. Before you know what kindness really is, you must lose things. Feel the future dissolve in a moment like salt in a weakened broth. What you held in your hand, what you counted and carefully saved, all this must go so you know how desolate the landscape can be between the regions of kindness. How you ride and ride thinking the bus will never stop, the passengers eating maize and chicken will stare out the window forever. Before you learn the tender gravity of kindness, you must travel where the black man, hands in white tie wraps, lies dead by the side of the road. You must see how this could be you, how he too was someone who journeyed through the night with plans, and the simple breath that kept him alive. Before you know kindness is the deepest thing inside, you must know sorrow is the other deepest thing. You must wake up with sorrow. You must speak it till your voice catches the thread of all sorrows and you see the size of the cloth. Then it is only kindness that makes sense anymore. Only kindness that ties your shoes and sends you out into the day to gaze at bread. Only kindness that raises its head from the crowd of the world to say, "It is I you have been looking for," and then goes with you everywhere like a shadow or a friend. Naomi Shihab's poem Kindness is our call to worship today. I'm Pastor Rielly with Windsor Mennonite Fellowship. The music that you're listening to was composed and performed live by my friend and housemate, Alfred. Our local place today is inside our home. We rent a small duplex in Walkerville on the east side of downtown Windsor. For me, one of the most sacred times lately has been listening to Alfred play the piano as it gently echoes through the halls of this old house. His playing has reminded me that in my weakest moments during the quarantine, that I can hold on. Rielly, hold on. There is still music to be played, songs to be written, and stories to be told. To begin, I need to let you in on a little secret. Pastors get hangovers. Not necessarily from partying on a Saturday night, but from pouring ourselves out on a Sunday morning. This is what could be described as a vulnerability hangover. After Sunday morning church, we've broken ourselves open and we're tired, our head hurts, and we're wondering if we said or did anything foolish. That's why they call it a hangover, or in our case, a pastor's hangover. On one Sunday evening, a few years ago, I was there. I poured myself out at church on Sunday morning, and I needed the evening alone, time to rest and recuperate. It so happened that the same evening, a local sister church was holding a dimly lit open mic coffee house style concert nearby. Perfect, I thought. This would be a great opportunity for me to just sit in the back somewhere, out of sight, have no responsibilities, and take in some live music. But sadly, being a public pastor has some drawbacks, which include being recognized and approached by people you don't really know. So there I was, sitting in the back corner of a dimly lit room, and through the darkness I see a guy I vaguely recognize, but he locks eyes with me and makes a beeline in my direction. I've been spotted. Within seconds, he's sitting down beside me and without asking permission, begins unloading his life story and opinions about every last little thing, expecting me to indulge. This will probably sound pretty unspiritual and unpastoral, but I was hoping that this would be over quick. I did not feel emotionally or mentally capable to hold space for this man. None of what he was saying had any urgency. He just wanted someone to talk to. And I get that. I've been there. But I wasn't the right person in this moment. And to my embarrassment, I was only half listening, I admit. I pretended to nod and agree as if I was listening. Right. Yes. But that only enabled him, emboldened him further to keep going. He went on and on and on. And I was growing more and more and more uncomfortable and impatient and even agitated. So I finally decided to speak up. I calmly suggested we talk another time because I was tired from Sunday morning church and hoping to just listen to some live music. But I also said he was welcome to sit with me and take in the show. He agreed, only to then jump right back into yet another thing he wanted to talk about, as if he heard nothing of my boundaries. And now I'm kind of panicking and trying to figure out, how am I going to get away? I'd indulged him for a time, I set up some boundaries, but now he wasn't respecting my own limits, and I was growing even more agitated and now desperate to get away. I felt like I was left with no other option but to cook up a great escape. I decided on the trusty old pastor escape plan, the restroom. If I hide in the restroom for a bit, hopefully he would find someone else to talk to by the time I was finished. So without needing to actually go, I excused myself to the restroom and swiftly made my escape. But as I'm walking through the dark room, I suddenly sense someone following behind me. And I look over my shoulder, and this guy has gotten up and is now following me to the washroom. Thinking fast, I went directly into the men's room, into one of the bathroom stalls, and sat down without even needing to go. Now this thin steel door and a porcelain depository were my only sanctuary. And as I feared, this guy enters the restroom not long after and begins to talk to me through the door of the toilet stall. Yeah, silent I sat there. I started to cry. Why won't this guy leave me alone, I thought. Can't he see that I'm exhausted and don't want to talk? I was trapped, and I was starting to get angry. All verbal and nonverbal communication had failed. This dude just wasn't getting it. I tried everything except being harsh for him to just empathize with my desire to be alone, and it wasn't registering. Yes, I could have been more direct, and maybe some of you in true Canadian fashion would have told him to take off, eh? But at the time, I didn't feel like I even had the emotional energy or capacity to enter into that kind of conflict. Shout out to all those Enneagram 9s out there. I decided to plant my feet in that stall and wait it out. I was determined to just sit there for as long as it takes, not say a word until he leaves. And just like that, anticlimactically, after a few more moments of him talking, he finished and awkwardly left the men's room. Now, I know I didn't handle this well, for my sake or his. But maybe you can relate to the experience when someone just isn't seeing you or listening to you or recognizing your needs, your cues, your boundaries, and simultaneously using you for their own personal verbal depository. Yeah, I'm sure there's some out there that know what I'm talking about. This guy, this guy clearly needed a friend. Someone to talk to. And come on, Rielly, what would Jesus do? Well, I'm glad you asked. Actually, Jesus tried to get away from people all the time, to just get some alone time to himself and pray. And it wasn't because he didn't care about people. See, I needed this guy to empathize with me. He was asking me to listen to all sorts of random stuff. And through the whole time he was talking, I desperately needed him to empathize with my own lack of energy. And instead, I got someone who was just interested in using me. Not okay. Social skills are not. Spiritual or unspiritual, whatever it is, it's not cool to ignore people's feelings or needs in order to share your own opinions or inappropriately impose yourself. We all need to be seen, heard, and respected. And maybe I wasn't seeing this guy. I was too consumed in myself and my work. But my point is, we all need some degree of empathy. Not just someone to know the facts of our situations and develop their own opinions, but someone to truly hear us and honor our needs and our feelings, whether it's distance or it's relationship, whether it's a listening ear or it's privacy. Because here's the thing, I don't remember a word of what that guy said to me. If he showed me some empathy and gave me some time alone, maybe I would have remembered some of the things that he had to say. But because he didn't respect my boundaries, I couldn't hear him. Because he wasn't showing me empathy, I couldn't hear whatever it is he wanted to tell me. So I'd like to ask you a question. With the protests going on around the world, with police brutality becoming center stage, when migrant workers have horrendous working and living conditions, when we've seen the horrid conditions of our elderly care homes, why do you think that your opinions matter or would be heard if you haven't explored your empathy for the same people you're forming opinions about? Let me ask you that again. Why do you think your opinions matter on all of these things if you haven't explored your empathy for the same people you are forming opinions about? See, until you can begin to honestly empathize with people that are calling out in their suffering, they're begging to be heard, to be recognized, to be seen, to be liberated, to be honored. Until you can begin to honestly empathize with people that are calling out in their sufferings, your opinions mean jack shit. They mean nothing. See, empathy is a crucially important task if we are going to develop our opinions. That they are not in a vacuum. They are not just those other people. When we encounter suffering, our first task is to empathize. And then out of that, who knows what kind of thoughts and actions and change we can catalyze. But empathy is a deeply personal and spiritual task. And I'm not the arbiter of who is and isn't practicing empathy. That's something between you and God. Only you know if you're choosing not to see and feel and respect the experiences of, say, our Black and brown and Asian and Indigenous brothers and sisters. And I'm not saying there's nothing to do. There's lots of things to do right now. And I'm not saying your opinions will never mean anything. And I'm not saying you have to agree with every single person who sheds a tear about their troubles. I'm suggesting that there is a necessary maturation process to undergo before your opinions are actually informed, which includes empathizing with the oppression or suffering of another person or people. And that's just not through YouTube videos and echo chambers. It's through human connection and this profound God-given tool in our brains and our bodies, the Jesus-shaped spiritual, social, and neurological grounds for developing our empathy. So would you go with me now into a scientific and biblical exploration? First, what is empathy? Empathy is the ability to connect, feel, and relate to the suffering and joys of another person by figuratively stepping into their shoes as best as we can and experiencing their feelings with them. It's different than sympathy. Writer and scholar Brené Brown defines sympathy as feeling for someone, while empathy is feeling with someone. Sympathy is usually importing your own feelings and bias about someone's situation, and usually at a privileged distance. But empathy is up close as you enter into the feelings of another as if it were your own. Empathy is far more intense. It removes that privileged distance, creating space for genuine connection. Now, according to neuroscience, they have discovered this feature in our brains called mirror neurons. And it works like this. If I have a healthy, growing, and active relationship with empathy, and I'm observing you going through an experience of anger, joy, frustration, or sadness to one degree or another, the neurons in my brain will mirror yours to some degree, as if I am experiencing your feelings. This is why they call it mirror neurons. Perhaps you've seen someone laugh and then you just began to laugh, even when you had no idea what you're laughing about. Or maybe it's through shared tears that you found connection with someone. Or if you've been angry at injustice or the cruelty lately from white supremacy and police brutality or unjust working environments, there's a good chance others have seen your anger and are angry along with you. Our neurons are being mirrored all the time. But friends, if you haven't noticed, we're not so good at empathy these days. Did you know that over the past 100 years or so, studies have shown that IQ has been on the rise, our intellectual capacity or quotient, but EQs have been lowering. EQ measures our emotional intelligence, which is the ability to recognize emotion in yourself and others, and our capacity to correctly define and express those emotions, empathy being a chief feature of our EQ. Our ability to show restraint, express grief, or show appropriate affection, and have self-awareness and navigate relationships are all dependent on our emotional intelligence, our EQ. And neuroscience has shown that unlike IQ, which is relatively fixed, we can actually grow or shrink our EQ. Empathy is either strengthened or weakened. That our brain is flexible enough that we can actually strengthen our empathy if we want. But in our culture, intellect is on the rise, but emotional intelligence and empathy is on the decline. But the good news is these are not just neurological realities. The science is a window into a profound spiritual reality of life with God and others. In fact, I'd like to propose to you that the reason empathy is such a central feature in us is because we're created in the image of God, and empathy is a core attribute of God. That strengthening empathy is connected to our relationship with God, our relationship with ourselves, and given to us in our faith communities by Jesus, and is modeled after Jesus. To lament with somebody, to listen, to grieve, to emotionally enter into the cry of the oppressed is to discover your own cry that's buried deep within you, and maybe you've forgotten it, where your suffering becomes connected with Black and Indigenous suffering. This becomes the first step towards participating in just and merciful communities, when we can connect with the injustices and suffering in our world as if it were our very own. And not only do you discover your cry and their cry, you discover a divine cry, a God who looks like Jesus on the cross. And this brings us back to our reading from the book of Hebrews, To avoid this notion of God feeling, theologians have come up with all sorts of half-baked theories about what they see in the scriptures. One of them they call the impassibility of God, that God expressing emotion isn't actually emotion. It's just anthropomorphic, meaning human attributes that are given to God to prove a point, but it's not literal. God is beyond these kinds of things. But there is a problem with this, and it's a really big problem, and it's Jesus. If, as Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3 says, that the Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, if Jesus is the exact representation of God, we have to wrestle with a theology of divine emotion and the empathy of God. Jesus had a really intense emotional life, from weeping with a funeral procession to angrily turning over tables in the temple, to the joy of children gathered around him, to the anxiety and stress in the Garden of Gethsemane for the suffering to come, from his compassion for the woman subject to lifelong bleeding, to his amazement at the faith of a Roman centurion, from his frustrated tears for the city of Jerusalem to Jesus' love for the rich man who could not part with his possessions. It's difficult to ignore the intensity of emotion Jesus displayed in his life and ministry, particularly his empathy for those suffering. And this is why the writer in the book of Hebrews, chapter 4, verse 15, writes, "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with us when we are weak and hurting." The writer of Hebrews makes a profound statement in this short verse. And you could summarize it this way: Jesus actually mirrors our neurons. The Greek word for empathy here is sympatheo. It's two words that are joined together: pathos, which means passion or to suffer, and sum, which means with. So very literally translated, it could say, we do not have a high priest who is unable to suffer with us when we are weak and hurting. That God shows us the path and power of empathy. In the book of Genesis, before anything changes for the Hebrew people experiencing slavery in Egypt, it says that God heard their cries. God hears and feels the cry of the oppressed and then responds. But do we? Do we hear the cries and respond if we claim to follow this God? Well, a lot of times we don't. Especially churches, we get defensive. We go, well, we have a hard time too. Or what about us? All lives matter. This kind of nonsense is against the very fabric of the heart of God, which hears the cries of the oppressed. And so we have a choice. If we are going to follow the God of the scriptures, we are also called to hear the cry of the oppressed and respond. And if we do not follow the God of the Bible. In the Christian story, God overcomes suffering through God becoming a co-sufferer. This radical act of divinely embodied empathy drives the story of the Bible, ultimately in Jesus. God enters into human suffering as a Middle Eastern Jewish peasant under the oppressive empire of Rome and under the forceful occupation of their national guard. This is where God shows up in the middle of it all. God's whole story is a story of embodied empathy that translates into action and movement towards healing and justice and mercy, the redemption of all things. We are made in God's image, and part of God's image we especially see in Jesus is our capacity and potential for empathy. This reminds me of a story in my early 20s when I was doing my undergrad. I was in my 4th year of school. I was away from home, and my family went through a significant crisis. There was a lot of challenges going on at home, and I couldn't be there with them. I couldn't help. I couldn't support them because I was at school. And it was eating me up inside, and things were getting just worse and worse. And I was starting to fall behind in my studies. I was not showing up for meetings, for student council. I was struggling. And then one day, the dean of students, his name is Mark Bond, a wise older man, pulled me into his office and he asked me what's going on. So I tell him everything that's happening with my family. And then he did something so unexpected. He burst out crying. And I was unprepared for this. I hadn't cried about it. I hadn't actually expressed any emotion. But then all of a sudden, seeing this wise older man weep for me, weep for my family, I was finally able to get in touch with how I was actually feeling and weep with him. He taught me something about empathy in that moment, and it's forever left its mark on me. I've carried that experience into my life and ministry to others because he was a priestly Jesus to me. He empathized with me in a way that I didn't even understand in myself, but needed someone to connect with me in. So if according to neuroscience, we can actually grow in empathy, what can we do to grow? Well, I would like to suggest 3 things that I think the scriptures teach as well that can be a way to exercise our empathy. And the first one is this: who do you spend time with? Are they the same as you? Do they look, talk, and act all like you? Are they among the same economic or status or demographic? Do they have the same plights, struggles as you? What I'm asking is, how expansive is your experience of the human struggle? If everyone is just like you that you spend time with, your capacity for empathy will be smaller. Secondly, practice loving your enemies. You may not think that you have any enemies, but you know what? You have people that you say that you don't like. There's people out there that you would just rather avoid or not be around. When we practice loving our enemies, we are stretching our capacity for kindness, compassion. This past week, I saw a photograph, and it was a picture of a black man carrying a white man over his shoulder out of the protest. A Black Lives Matter protester reached out to a counter-protester who was injured and lifted him up and carried him out of the fray. It was a beautiful act of enemy love and challenges, I think, a lot of our misinformation or disinformation about what's going on in these protests. Some of the problems with our discourse politically and socially is a complete unwillingness to see things from another person's lens. We don't want to listen to the experience of harm. Instead, we become defensive and narcissistic, claiming that our suffering is the worst kind of suffering and only real suffering. And it becomes a competition for who has it worse. It's pretty foolish and narcissistic. On the other hand, more progressive Christian communities will focus on shaming people for not being progressive enough, essentially eating their own, or preventing people who are beginning to explore their power and privilege and personal responsibility from going any further, which then perpetuates cycles of harm. Somebody who was on the road to change, it was shut down. But when we learn how to have dialogue and to stay at the table in discussion without shaming people, we're actually minimizing harm. See, shame never changed anyone's mind or moved the needle. It just makes people worse. But empathy actually empowers people to change when they know that you're actually caring about them and how they feel, even if you disagree. And thirdly, how do we grow in empathy? I think it's through seeing and embracing differences in people. I've heard it said once in a while, I don't see color. No, we need to see color. We need to see differences in experience. Statements like, I don't see color, are this deflective way of trying to avoid taking responsibility and doing something about racism. Now, the last part of the verse, Hebrews chapter 4, verse 16, says, let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. The invitation here is to approach, receive, and find. Sometimes the hardest things to do in life are approach, receive, and find. That is your invitation. To approach is a choice to engage in relationship, to consent to experiencing another person, to consent to experiencing God. To receive is that posture of humble openness, to be given what you alone cannot give to yourself, to live open-handed in a receptive posture. And thirdly, to find is the act of learning or discovering something new in yourself and others through receiving from approaching. There is so much to find. You know, the God that we know in Jesus is approachable, not standoffish. It's receptive, not defensive, and filled with empathy, not dead and detached from human suffering. If you believe this, anything that God gives us, we are called to give away. In other words, Jesus leads us to be people who are approachable, not standoffish, receptive, not defensive, and filled with empathy, not dead and detached from human suffering. Thank you for joining us on our journey in this series, Local Hope in a Hot Mess. I know that people have been watching and listening in all over the place, and we are so grateful. If you have benefited from our teaching videos online during the pandemic, I invite you to donate, to give to our church so that we can continue to put out this content. Check our Windsor Mennonite Fellowship Facebook page. You can search us on the Canada Helps website under Windsor Mennonite Fellowship, and you can give there monthly or for a one-time donation. I'm going to be taking some time off from teaching over the next few weeks, and in place of our teaching team, we will be centering Black voices and teachers to help us grow in our empathy, learning, and our action. Links to these videos will be posted on the Windsor Mennonite Fellowship Facebook page and on our YouTube channel under the Anti-Racism at WMF playlist. And now for one announcement before we close our time together. We are happy to announce our first gathering in person will be on Sunday, July 19th, and then the third Sunday of every month thereafter. An outdoor location is yet to be determined, so keep an eye on our Windsor Mennonite Fellowship Facebook page for more announcements. But in the meantime, mark your calendars for Sunday, July the 19th, 2020. An outdoor, in-person church service is at hand. And now for a word of benediction. May the mercy and grace and empathy of God in Christ surround you and fill you. In Christ, the empathy of God is now a cosmic reality, intrinsic to life itself. And may you choose participation in relationships of life over systems of death. And may Christ mirror your neurons. And may this empower you to be a priest of God to others and to be seen, heard, respected, and honored. May you lay down your defenses, your pride, your opinions, and may you discover a new way of listening and learning, of being informed. May you discover the cry of the oppressed is also the same cry in you to be heard and seen. May you discover a unity and solidarity in that cry, so we may work together for God's glory and the redemption of all things. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.